Okay, hello everyone. It's Amanda Mackenzie here. I'm the CEO of the Climate Council, Australia's independent evidence-based organisation. So I'm really glad that you could join us today for this conversation with Minister Chris Bowen. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that we're meeting on today. And for me, that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I wanted to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge their deep and enduring connection to country. This always was Aboriginal land. I invite you to share in the chat which lands you're joining us from tonight. And of course, I think for many of our viewers tonight, Minister Bowen is very familiar to you. You've seen him in the news, particularly the last few weeks. Chris has been the Minister for Climate and Energy since 2022, and during that time has driven some of Australia's most significant climate reforms. So legislated Australia's 2030 target, reformed the safeguard mechanism, launched the capacity investment scheme, which is accelerating renewables and domestic clean energy manufacturing, and in the lead up to the 2025 federal election, announced a $2.3 billion cheaper home batteries program, which has seen incredibly strong uptake in the last couple of months, which we'll touch on a bit later. And our conversation tonight comes at a really important and very busy time. Chris, in the last fortnight, you've stood beside the Prime Minister and the Treasurer announcing Australia's 2035 climate target, which will guide our climate policy for the next decade. That arrived just a few days after the release of the National Climate Risk Assessment and Adaptation Plan, which found some dire risks for Australia. It also came at a few days after a major gas project in WA, the North West Shelf, was formally approved by the Albanese government. And last week, you've been in the United Nations in New York, promoting Australia's bid for a UN Climate Summit, COP31, to be held with the Pacific in Australia next year. So there's a lot to unpack there, and it's been a really busy couple of weeks for you. So thank you so much for joining us today to have this conversation.
Thanks, Amanda. Looking forward to it. And I'm joining you from my home in Western Sydney, which is the lands of the Darug people. And just around the corner, about 500 metres from where I live, there's a small park in a suburb called Pemulwuy, which recognises the first act of reconciliation in Australian history, which was a peace meeting between Samuel Marsden and female elders of the Darug people on the 3rd of May, 1805. And we're very proud to have that first act of reconciliation in our community. And as I said, about 500 metres from where I live.
Oh, that's a very powerful story. Well, for tonight's webinar, we've collated hundreds of questions that have been submitted, and we'll try and get through as many as possible. So for those that are online watching tonight, encourage you to use the chat to share any further thoughts, as we always do. But please, I know there's a lot of passion here, but keep your comments constructive and respectful. Chris, I thought we'd start on a more personal note. You've said that the ministerial role is by far the most important job that you've ever had. What made this something motivating for you? Did you have a aha moment on climate that many people speak of?
Yeah, it is the most important job I've done, and I've done a lot. I've been treasurer and, held a lot of portfolios, and by a long stretch, in no hesitation of doubt, is the most important job I've done in my view. And look, it started, to be honest, in a conversation between me and the now Prime Minister, then Leader of the Opposition, and the then Shadow Minister for Climate Change, Mark Butler, and I was doing the health job, which really sort of started with the genesis to say, look, we keep winning the moral argument for action on climate change. We keep losing elections, and maybe we need to shake things up a bit and make more of an economic argument for action on climate change, to say action on climate change is an obligation to future generations, it's an obligation to the rest of the world. But even if it wasn't, we should do it anyway, because here's all the reasons why it's in our economic best interests. And sort of thought that maybe being a former treasurer and someone with an economics degree, I could prosecute that argument. And then, of course, I threw myself into it. And what job would you rather do than this? It's tough. There's plenty of free advice in the newspapers every day. Everyone understands energy and climate, and everyone's got a view. And I get that everywhere I go. And when I do catch up with my international colleagues, as I did last week, we sometimes compare notes and say, "Are you the most controversial person in your cabinet?" And we all say, "Yeah, yeah, we are. I am actually." So, just because of the nature of the highly emotive nature of the work. But
Mm,
despite all that, it is the biggest economic opportunity. It's the biggest challenge. It's the biggest issue facing future generations. If we get it right, there's a lot for our country. If we get it wrong, we'll lose elections. The Labor Party's lost elections on this issue in the last 20 years, several of them. And if we lose elections, all action stops. And so, and I see this as in keeping with the big. I don't want to be too partisan on this call, but the big sweeping Labor reforms of the last 30 years, superannuation, Medicare,
mm,
all of them. This is now the reform of our times. Paul Keating has said that to me, mate. This is as big as anything I did, in fact, bigger. And I think he's right about that
mm.
because there is so much at stake for the livelihoods of ourselves and our future generations, and people we care about in the Pacific and Southeast Asia.
Absolutely. And do you think we're doing better at winning the economic argument now, both in terms of the risks and the opportunities?
I do, but it's an ever receding finishing line. Like,
Mm,
because deniers and delayers will just shapeshift the arguments to suit
mm,
themselves, and we've just got to be constantly vigilant. And they'll just, all the opinion polls show that support for climate action remains very strong. And if anything, when you consider the heft of the opinion pages every day, which with climate denial increasing. I had thought, to be honest, that climate denial had gone, and now people were sort of gone to all too hardism. But climate denial is coming back. So it's not that bad, or humans don't cause it, or there's nothing we can do anyway. That's back um, in opinion pages of newspapers. So I do think we're doing much better we've got the facts on our side. Renewables are the cheapest form of energy, not just now, ever known to humankind. Nobody's ever been able to make energy as cheaply as we can now. And the world is doing it. This whole argument, which we might touch on to say, oh, well, we're only 1% emissions, the Western world isn't doing it. That is nonsense. Um,
mm,
the investment is $2 trillion. It's twice what the investment in fossil fuels is. Renewables will overtake coal this year as the largest source of
mm.
energy around the world. China's putting in more each year than the entire US capacity, more each month, on any typical month than our capacity. So, and it's not just China. India's making big strides. There are
Mm.
headwinds. There are headwinds, of course there are, and there's political debates, but actually the economics are showing that the world is getting on with it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I find most inspiring is looking backwards and seeing how far we've come
Yeah,
and the sort of expectations of where we could be versus where we are. And, it's never enough, but we're progressing in the right direction.
yeah, absolutely.
You announced the 2035 target a couple of weeks ago, and it will obviously shape our climate policy for the next decade. Can you explain to the audience why it matters, what it is, and what expanded or additional policies you're going to need to meet that target?
Yeah, so look, I understand, everyone on this call will have views about the target, but it's my job to deliver a target which I can put my hand on my heart and say is deliverable. And I believe it's ambitious though. Like, I've got to be straight with you. This is not going to be a straightforward task to deliver, nor should it be. You would have heard me say many times the target's got to be two things in my view: ambitious and achievable. Easier to have an ambitious target, just pick a number, and that's ambitious. Easier to have an achievable target. We are on track for 51% emissions reduction by 2035. That's what current settings would achieve. So that's very achievable. You've got to have a target which lists that, stretches behaviour, drives investment, but it also, is achievable. And that's important too, not only for credibility with the people, but if you have a target which the financial markets and investors look at and say that's not achievable, it's not going to it's going to be counterproductive, because we want them investing in Australia. And our target is very important for sending that signal to investors to say, here's what we're trying to achieve. If you come and invest in Australia, you'll get a return as you help us achieve that. And if that's not a credible figure, you're not going to get that investment. So the target of 62 to 70 I've just come back from New York, as you said. It was very well received around the world. Governments and groups around the world look at that and say that is a serious target. It is, compares to the UK at 78 and Norway. Norway, we are either more ambitious than Norway or less ambitious, depending on how you define it, but very close. And then Europe with a very similar target to us. And then, there's no other targets in the world with a 7 involved in them. Brazil, the current COP president, 59 to 67 is their target. So we are higher than that. But in terms of, how ambitious it is, it involves a halving of emissions from today. So, it's set at 2005 levels, but starting at 2025 to 2035, we've got to halve emissions. Or it's taking transport out, all our transport emissions out, eradicating them twice over. That's not straightforward. So that's got to be done. That's not easy. And then, or looking at per capita on 2005 levels, it's a emissions reduction of high 70s to 81%. All that is ambitious, very ambitious, and most of that's just to get to 62. So it's going to take some doing. I believe we can and will do it, but it's not an automatic thing. And it's not a lot of people just think about electricity, and no doubt we'll talk about that. But electricity is a third of our emissions. And in one sense, the easiest, because we know what to do, right? You just keep going with renewables
Yeah.
and transmission and storage. Like I'm not saying that's easy, but we know what it is we need to do. You've got agriculture where, frankly, there's need for a lot more research and development about how we can reduce emissions. Industry, which, is so broad and sweeping. We might touch on the safeguard mechanism. There's 215 facilities, but they're all different, Qantas's and Virgin's ability to reduce emissions is, their technology available is a lot different to an aluminium smelter, is a lot different to a bauxite mine, is a lot different to a coal mine, but they've all required to reduce them by 5% a year in effect. So, all this is work to do. Now, you asked, sorry, I'm going on for a while, but you asked what policies. I mean, we not just put out a target, we put out a net zero plan, 6 sector plans, and a bunch of policies, including $1 billion to support low carbon liquid fuels. We want to electrify, but not everything can be electrified. A lot of fuels are required for industry as well as transport and resources. It's a great opportunity for Australia because we can grow feedstock and process that feedstock, create jobs. So $1 billion for that. $2 billion recapitalisation of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Money for EV charging, curbside charging. A lot of people who don't have a driveway have trouble getting a charger. Now, there's all sorts of things we can do about that, but one of the things we can do is more telegraph pole charging. And I'll finish on this one. There's more, but I'll finish on this one. The one I think really hasn't had that much attention, but is really important, is a new focus on energy efficiency and energy performance. Because the easiest emission to avoid is an emission you don't have because you haven't used electricity. We started work on that in our first term, but with a very busy agenda, we didn't get to finish it. And there's a lot more to do. So we are expanding the neighbours and natters. I won't nerd you out on what that means, but it's important. Take my word for it. And importantly, you would have heard maybe of the electricity statement of opportunities and the gas statement of opportunities, which is where AEMO points to gaps and says we need this and we need that. We're going to have a demand statement of opportunities to say, well, here's what we can do on demand, which will help shape that investment and shape decisions to reduce electricity use as well as make it more renewable.
Thanks for unpacking that. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it is a significant increase in Australian action compared to the trajectory that you described of 51% with current policies. The Climate Council and many other organisations, science orgs, unions, and a campaign from more than 500 businesses called Business for 75 campaign for a higher target to protect Australians from the climate crisis, and a number of groups released data on their view that you could go beyond 75, Deloitte and Climate Works and others that then argued that a higher target was doable. So there's obviously different views on what's necessary and what is achievable. What stopped you from going stronger?
Well, we have the most rigorous target setting process in the world. And I'm proud of that. And we did that. So that's in our Climate Change Act. So other countries, other ministers just pick a figure, frankly. The cabinet says, well, let's go for this. And they announce it. That's not our approach. Um, it would be unlawful for me to set a target without the advice of the Climate Change Authority. We don't have to listen to that advice, but it's unlawful not to consider it. And the Climate Change Authority did a very good job, supported by Treasury modelling and supported by the CSIRO modelling. And when the Climate Change Authority looked at it and said, look, what we need is maximum possible effort. That's what the science requires. Have the target as high as it possibly can be. And then they looked at the sorts of things that I've mentioned, plus more, the sorts of things that would be necessary to get to 62 to 70, and they're all big and none of them are easy. And then they say, if you go higher than this, I don't have the words in front of me, but it's words to the effect of there would be unacceptable environmental, economic, and social costs to pay in the short term. Now, I accept there's other people with other views and other work, but having been through the Climate Change Authority work, the Treasury work, the CSIRO work, I was satisfied that I could recommend to the Cabinet to accept the Climate Change Authority advice, which contains, it's a very well credentialed committee. It's not just the chair, Matt Keane, who does an excellent job, former Energy Minister of New South Wales. So he understands not only the need to act, but he understands the complexity of action and how hard these things can be. A target is easier said than met, but also, people with strong experience in industrial decarbonisation, business, climate science, Indigenous issues. So a very well credentialed board. And I decided to recommend to the Cabinet to accept their advice. And I stand by that decision because, as I said, I believe we'll get to 62, and I believe we will, if the country leans in, we have a chance of getting to 70. By that I mean, the federal government is the most important player. We have a lot of levers, but we're not the only player. There's states, and states can make it easier or harder. There's local government. There's households. Households are leaning in massively at the moment. If they keep going on that, and we'll touch on some of those things, then we can really shoot for the top of the range, but it's not going to be easy.
Mm. And they say that about good things, don't they? That they're often challenging. And I think
Totally.
that's been our response, certainly, is let's aim for the top and see if we can't go further if circumstances lend itself in that direction. And state governments, business, we all need to get behind this. Absolutely. And one of the reasons for doing that is the National Climate Risk Assessment, the picture that it painted for us, a very sobering picture of escalating impacts. And it came out just a few days before targets, sort of underlining that urgency of action. What stood out to you in that? Obviously, you're pretty across all of these risks, but is there particular risks that keep you up at night?
Well, I try I try and sleep in my job, although having just come back from New York, it's not as straightforward as it might
Yes.
otherwise be. Um, Look, there was nothing in the report, and I really recommend to those who haven't had a chance to look at it. It's all online. Please have a look at it because it's a very thorough piece of work. And I should say, the government, I wrote not a word of it. It's a report handed to me by the Australian Climate Service, supported by the Bureau of Meteorology and the CSIRO and Geoscience Australia and the Bureau of Statistics. I mean, our best people across the government wrote this report, and I didn't get my pen out and put black lines through it. I released it as I received it, and that's as it should be. Um, I think the thing that's important to note in the report that there isn't a community in Australia that's not affected by climate
Mm,
change. But what I think the most important thing to underline is, for those in the political debate saying climate change, people in the regions don't care, it's all an inner city obsession. It's the people in the outer suburbs and the regions who have more at stake than anyone else.
yeah.
Every community is impacted, every Australian is impacted. No one gets off, without an impact. But those in the outer suburbs where I live, here in Smithfield, those in the bush where natural disasters have the biggest impact. I mean, we're all impacted by floods and other natural disasters, but if you're in a regional town, you are much more prone to bushfires and drought and flood and cyclone. All that is impacted in some way, not always straightforward, but in some way. So I think it's really just underlining that point that this is not an inner city thing, and all the jokes that people say about rising sea levels and we'll all have waterfront property soon. All that I find pretty offensive,
Mm,
frankly,
mm,
because these are real issues that will impact on in a big way.
mm. In In the risk assessment, you look at different levels of temperature rise and the corresponding damage. So, what sort of level of risk do you think we should be preparing for? And importantly, who should be paying that cost? Because at the moment, primarily the communities who are most exposed to those risks, those regional communities that you're talking about, whether it's flood or other things, are the ones that are receiving the increased insurance costs, mopping up disasters, etc.
So, in terms of what we should be preparing for, the fact of the matter is the world is warming, and you know, emissions could be net zero tomorrow, and we would still have to adapt to climate change. It's having an impact today, and it will have an impact into the foreseeable future. But as the report makes clear, and as we already knew, the difference between 1.5 and 2 and 2.5 is enormous. So by the way, it's the difference between 1.5 and 1.7. These are
Yeah.
big impacts. So I don't know. I mean, I don't spare a waking hour trying to keep 1.5 alive, and that's important. There's scientists who say we'll overshoot it and then we'll have to get back, with things like direct air capture, which are not yet realistic, but people are working on them. I just think, Amanda, the way I look at it is
Mhm.
everything we do now, if it reduces global warming by zero point 0.5 of a degree, that is worth it. That is
Yeah.
worth it. In terms of your question, who should pay? Look, it's going to be an all of society effort. Again, the federal government holds a lot of levers, but so do the states, so does local government, so does industry, the insurance industry, but everyone, communities, like we are just all going to have to be in this together.
Mm. So I wanted to move on to talking about fossil fuel approvals. That was the question that throughout the submitted questions, it was about 40% of questions in that vein. Patricia, Jacqueline, Chris, many others. And the crux of it is whether it's a contradiction for the government to continue to approve coal and gas projects, 31 at our count, while also pursuing clean energy and raising our climate targets. How do you respond to that?
So the way I think about it, Amanda, and I obviously this is not my first time having this conversation. It gets raised with me a lot. Um, the way I see it, though, is you can't think about these things in isolation. We cannot transition away from fossil fuels without building renewable energy. These are different sides of the same coin, and we've got a lot more renewable energy to build here and around the world. And the idea that you can just focus on supply and not worry about demand is not an idea that I share. The fossil fuels will stop being used when demand falls. Um, and demand will fall when we build renewable energy here and around the world, and we can help the rest of the world with that and export renewable energy. I am still, optimistic about the future of green hydrogen, for example. It faces headwinds, but it is the only game in town for replacing natural gas in heavy industry. It will play a role in decarbonising heavy transport, big transport, long distance transport. So I'm optimistic about that. But you've got to see these things, I think, as part of a total continuum. The idea that we can just not approve this coal mine or that gas facility, and the coal or the gas won't be, exercised, burnt, if we haven't reduced the demand for those things, just isn't true. And I care about one thing, and in this job, one thing overriding everything else: emissions reduction, reducing emissions. And I don't find the whole, let's just stop approving this, it won't actually reduce emissions. Personally, that's not how I see it. I completely understand and respect the arguments, but again, I've got to look the Australian people in the eye and say, what we do here will reduce emissions. And I can say that about our policies. Now, ultimately, if we build that renewable energy and help the rest of the world and build the green hydrogen, which we are a key player around the world, then of course fossil fuel demand will fall, and that's the case. But there isn't a country in the world that is saying, we're going to stop exporting fossil fuels. And again, there's a lot of apart from there's one, sorry, Colombia, but there's no other, and there isn't a country in the world that isn't one of two things: a fossil fuel exporter or a fossil fuel importer. Every country in the world is one of those things. And you can't say that either of them are wholly responsible. A fossil fuel importer's got a role to play in reducing emissions? Absolutely. A fossil fuel exporter's got a role to play in reducing emissions? Yes. It's on both of us. And the idea that one or the other gets off is not, I think, one that I share.
Mm. I understand the argument around demand, and certainly that would be a very important part of the equation for Australia to play in building renewables here and in other places. But if we just rely on waiting for demand to change, there may well be countries that indefinitely burn more fossil fuels in 2050 or beyond. What should countries like Australia do on the supply side, and what can we do with other exporting countries to change that side of the equation as well?
Great question. I think it's a couple of things. Firstly, it's the political conversation. I won't go into too much detail, but I have a lot of conversations with my international colleagues. Some of them go a lot easier than others. You know, um, there are countries like the German minister, including under the new government, who say, we are all in. We need your green hydrogen. Keep going. And there are other countries where the conversation is a bit more tricky. And say, when we came to office in particular, saying, well, hang on, what are you doing? This threatens our gas exports, imports where, so you talk to them about the opportunities and what we can do together. And the other thing we can do is build our renewable energy. One of the advantages, we call ourselves, potential for a renewable energy superpower. And why is that the case? Well, one, it's partly because our renewable energy resources are so good. We have the best solar in the world and above average wind. So that gives us in total the best renewable energy resources in the world, plus in some cases what you need for hydro, not across the board in Australia, but enough cases for it to count. But that's in itself not enough. The big advantage we have is that our population isn't so big that it requires all the energy that we can produce. So we can export. So that sort of compares favorably, say, the United States, who does have good renewable resources, but also is a huge energy consumer. So we have the opportunity then to say to countries like Japan and Korea and Singapore and Germany and others to say, listen, you have challenges. Singapore doesn't have the room for renewable energy. One thing renewable energy takes is space. They don't have any. That's why, we're talking to them about sun cable and exporting renewable energy to them. It's a big project, expensive, it's difficult, but, it's got a huge amount of potential. They're also talking to other countries about cables to import renewable energy, but, we have a lot to offer. So it's the political conversation and working together, and it's the just getting on with the job and building the export potential because, at the moment, we can't, at the moment, people do use natural gas or fossil gas because green hydrogen is not commercial. We've got to fix that over time.
Mm. And of course, the challenge is that no matter where the fossil fuels are burnt, it does harm Australians. And some of the projects that are being approved go out to 2070. Well, the Northwest Shelf recent approval does. And if we're in 2070 and we're still in a world where Australia is exporting fossil fuels, I'd say we're probably in a world where we've blown past 2 degrees. We probably haven't done that transition that you've just described around the clean exports here, or the way we've done it, we're still exporting fossil fuels at the same time. So clearly the government's not of a mind at this point in time to rule out fossil fuels or to put in place a pathway to exclude exports at some point. But do you think that there is a moment in time in which ethical governments need to make that assessment and say we will not keep selling this stuff beyond a certain point?
Well, I think, look, again, Minister Watts made a decision based on the law before him. Uh, he had to implement the law of the land. That's what we do as ministers, and that law was very, very clear. And he's looking at a reform process about that law at the moment, as you know, but the law of the land is very, very clear. And also, we've talked about the safeguard mechanism. This is a facility covered by the safeguard mechanism, which requires net zero by 2050. Also, he's got conditions which require emissions to be reduced by 60% by 2030. So, again, I know this is a more complicated argument, but again, I'm just pulling it out there in terms of the facts. So that is what we're doing. Now, again, I think the way I see it is my job is to leave nothing on the field, to work with other countries to build the case for decarbonisation here and abroad, and to help them with that journey. And we do that a lot, and that will see ultimate emissions reduction. I just want to say this, Amanda, you're not making this argument, but I do just want to sort of get out now. But there are those who say, oh, look, Australia's only 1% of emissions. What we export is much more important. I just want to urge people to be very, very careful about that argument, because that plays into the hands of deniers and delayers who also say we're 1% of emissions. Now, if you add all the countries that are 1% of emissions up, you get to 40% of emissions. So the idea that the 5 countries that are 2% of emissions or more, that add up to 60%, it's all on them, and the rest of us who are 40% don't have to do anything, it just, I mean, blows my mind. It's such a ridiculous argument. And again, it's the biggest argument I see now on the right. Oh, we're only 1% of emissions. Well, I'm less than 1% of the tax base of Australia, but I still pay my tax. That's what we do, and you do as well. You're 0.0001% of the tax base as well. But more importantly, it's just nonsense. And as I said, even if it wasn't a moral obligation to the rest of the world, it's in our economic best interest anyway. But I just wanted to say that because I do think there's a risk that those on the progressive side of the argument can fall into making the same argument that deniers make. And I think that's pretty dangerous.
Mm. Well, we can agree to disagree on fossil fuel exports, and we'll keep talking to Minister Watt about the EPBC Act reform as well. But to go to your portfolio and the safeguard mechanism in particular, we've had quite a few questions about the safeguard. And as you said, it regulates 215 of Australia's biggest industrial polluters. And there is concern about potential exploitation of loopholes in the safeguard. That was from Kathy. Janet also asked, how can offsets have credibility if they're misused by coal and gas? So broadly, the points across a number of different people was that I think, to my mind, go to the safeguards being reviewed in the next year. And what's your thinking around the use of offsets and how much that will be a focus of the review? The concerns that we have is particularly about the unlimited use of offsets and whether offsets can be prioritised for longer term industries like cement or metals rather than fossil fuels. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. And I'll take a few minutes on this because this is a big topic. But the first thing I want to say is that the safeguard reforms, the most important thing, the biggest rebuttal I have to those points is it is working. It has delivered in its first year on-site emissions reductions, not offsets, on-site emissions reductions equivalent to a third of Australia's domestic aviation industry. That is not nothing. That in 1 year, that is quite an achievement, frankly, of our safeguard reforms. The safeguard mechanism operated for many years and did diddly squat. We came along and reformed it, and now it's delivering real on-site emission reductions from the 215 biggest emitters. Now, do we allow the use of offsets in addition to that on-site emissions abatement, which is a third of Australia's domestic aviation? Yes. Why? For a few reasons. One is, I think you sort of hinted at this and acknowledged this, that because and I referred to it before as well, because it covers the 215 biggest emitters, they're all different and they all have different options, and some have more options than others. It is hard to abate cement at the moment. We're working on things and there are things you can do, but it's hard work. It's not easy to make cement and reduce emissions by 5% a year. The airlines, we're working on sustainable aviation fuel and other things, but the options are limited. So if you're going to have a regime which covers all 215 biggest emitters, or anyone who emits more than 100,000 tonnes a year, that 215 can go up and down a little bit, then you've got to allow some flexibility to do that, because the 5% emissions reduction, 4.9% emissions reduction we require each year as a matter of law is not easy, and is either technically impossible or commercially very difficult for some of these facilities. Now, if we'd said to people, what we're going to do is we're going to require emissions reduction, but if you can't do it, you're going to pay a tax to the government, right? And that's going to be called a carbon price. There'd be people who said, oh, that's really good. Well, no, what we have said is to people, you're required to reduce emissions by 5% a year. If you can't do that, we're going to require you to buy offsets, which also have emissions reductions impacts. I'm going to refer to some people who call it greenwashing in a moment. So we're actually going to get you to reduce emissions by doing that. And you're going to have to keep doing that until you find a way of reducing emissions at site. Then the boards are going to say after a while, why are we buying all these offsets? Why aren't we investing in emissions reduction so we don't have to buy these offsets? And by the way, in the meantime, we've got emissions reduction from the offsets. Now, I am going to push back on the argument that all offsets are nonsense and it's all greenwashing. I'm going to push back on that. because we have the most regulated offsets market in the world. We don't allow the use of international offsets. There were plenty of people who asked to use international offsets when we set up the safeguard reforms. There were plenty of submissions saying, can we buy offsets from, other countries where we can't, I could not verify if the emissions reductions are real. We do not allow that. The emissions reduction must be in Australia. It's regulated by the Emissions Reduction Advisory Committee and the Clean Energy Regulator, very strict regulations in place. I have, as you probably have, I'm sure you have, Amanda, been out on site and seen some of the projects. I don't accept that they don't reduce emissions. I mean, I've walked Arnhem Land and seen the savannah burning, which employs hundreds of First Nations people and reduces emissions by millions of tonnes a year by taking their learnings as to how we can best manage the savannah. I mean, that is real emissions reduction. I don't accept it's greenwashing. I will push back on that very strongly. There'd be more of an argument if we allowed international offsets. That would be a legitimate argument, but we don't allow that. Now, the review is genuine. There'll be people who say it's too strict. There'll be people who say it's not strict enough. That's the case when we did the reforms. It'll be a genuine process, and I will consider sensible reforms to the safeguard mechanism. But we've got to let it work for a little bit. And the fact that it's reduced emissions by the equivalent of a third of Australia's domestic aviation, not counting emissions reduction from offsets, just on site, tells me this is a reform which is working. And I just ask people, accept there's a legitimate argument, legitimate views, but don't just dismiss the safeguard reforms and say I don't like offsets without going through the facts, because the facts are it's delivering big emissions reduction on site and then offset reductions in addition as a bonus.
Mm. I'd love to talk more about the safeguard and offsets, but I'm conscious of time and we've got a whole lot more questions that are coming through. So I'll try and kind of whip through a few more questions with you, Chris. And I wanted to go to households because, as you mentioned earlier, households play a really important role in the energy transition. And as many in our audience know who have put solar panels on their own roof, 4 million Australians have put solar panels on their roof, which is a staggering increase, cuts pollution, cuts electricity bills, and batteries are another great opportunity that are increasingly being utilised. So the Cheaper Home Batteries program came in a couple of months ago. It'd be great to hear about that program, how people can utilise it to get batteries on their own house, but also to hear about the social equity. We hear that argument a lot. Is it accessible to all Australians? What are the challenges in terms of renters and people that don't necessarily have the upfront cash to put batteries on properties?
So firstly, perhaps I always, like to remind myself that maybe some people don't know what the actual policy is. So I'll spend just a couple of seconds on that. 30% rebate. So the batteries are 30% cheaper than they were on the 1st of July. And that's available to every single Australian. It's not means tested. And it's just available to businesses, community groups, anybody, basically, as long as you've got solar panels or will put in solar panels. It's got to be attached to solar panels. Now, Australians are taking this up, really strongly. Today, we've surpassed 71,000 batteries installed since the 1st of July. And to your point about equity, interestingly, the biggest take-up is in outer suburbs and regions. The lowest take-up is inner cities and, the North Shore of Sydney and similar areas. I think that shows Australians are getting on with it. And again, it underlines the myth that somehow batteries are, or action on climate change is some sort of inner city obsession. It turns Australians with a battery and solar from being a consumer of energy to a prosumer of energy. So we are producing and consuming at the same time and puts you more in charge. You can choose to sign up for a virtual power plant, which means that basically you feed into the grid when prices are high and you feed off the grid when prices are low. And that helps the grid, but it also means that you will go from usually having an energy bill to an energy rebate. You'll get a payment every month. And a lot of Australians are doing that. You don't have to under our scheme. You can just use the battery for your own use, and that's great too. But, a lot of Australians are doing the VPP. So this is going absolute gangbusters. And if you haven't done it yet, please have a good look at it. On renters and apartment dwellers, it is hard work. There is no simple solution. it is the 30% rebate applies to everyone, so a landlord can access it if they choose. But I accept, there'd be plenty of landlords who aren't going to do it, even
Mm,
though it increases the value of their house. Um, but just today, I was out with Penny Sharp at an apartment complex, which is putting solar panels with support of both governments. So there are programs to do it. And I was talking to the secretary of the body corporate, and I said, "Hey, what about a battery?" She said, "That's next. We're working on that." So there are government programs which support. Again, it's not simple or straightforward. The strata's got to want to do it. There's a process to go through, but we are supporting it. There's been 500 apartments approved already in under that scheme. So again, I'm not suggesting that's the answer to all problems, but I am suggesting we are aware of the issues when it comes to apartments and renters. And there are government programs in place. We've got an agreement with every state except for Queensland. Queensland ripped up their agreement with us, but every other state has opportunities for renters and apartment dwellers to get support for solar. And as I said, and once you've got solar, then you can think about getting a battery as well, which will be 30% cheaper.
mm. Yeah, it's fantastic. And it's inspiring when you see the community really getting behind a
Yeah.
policy like that.
Yeah. And
Mm,
also, one final point is that
yeah.
obviously, on the equity point, Amanda, obviously it helps those people who get a battery really well, but it also helps everyone else because those 71,000 batteries we've got out there, that's right now, as we speak at, 7:15 at night, reducing demand on the grid because, we're all powering off our battery at the moment, not calling from the grid. That means less gas, which is the most expensive form. That's putting downward pressure on prices for absolutely everyone.
Mm. And last term you legislated, just to move on to another sector, transport, you legislated the new vehicle efficiency standards, which we were advocating for as well. We were really pleased to see that. And it's increased new EV sales from 2% to 10%, which is fantastic. Related to the battery question, we had a number of questions. Keith and Mike wanted to know what's the latest on people being able to feed their battery
Yeah.
storage from solar during the day into the grid at night, the vehicle to grid opportunity. Can you use policy levers to make that happen?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and I think it's a really important part of the future because inevitably, as great as home batteries are, and I think they're pretty great. The battery in your driveway will be much more powerful than the battery in your garage
Mm,
because it's got to get you around. So therefore, it's got to be bigger and better. It's normally be about 5 times more powerful than the battery in your garage. Now, at the moment, it is hard to access that battery to power your house. We've made it legal. So there was no standard before. So we've come along and asked Standards Australia to write us a standard to allow vehicle grid. They've done that. So it's now doable. You can do it. That doesn't mean it's easy or happening as much as we would like. Um, but there is good progress. So just in the last couple of weeks, Origin and Ausgrid have announced pilots with certain providers, car types. So if you live in areas where those pilots are available, please check it out. The company should explain the details about how the pilots work, not me, because it's not my sort of, I haven't been involved in doing it. To their credit, they've done it, but I certainly encourage them to do it and welcome them doing it. And then they're subsidising the cost of a reverse charger because it is more expensive than a normal charger in your driveway. It costs more to have a reverse charger up front. But the abilities that it gives to the consumer, again, that prosumer I was talking about, to say, well, I'll charge my car in the middle of the day when energy is really cheap, and I'll use it to power my house or feed into the grid at night if energy is expensive. Helps everyone, helps the grid. If every car in Australia was electric, which obviously we're many years off, but just go with me for the sake of the argument. If every car in Australia was electric and we have reverse charging as standard, then that's 5 Snowy 2.0s.
that's
Um,
huge.
so it's a huge potential.
Mm. Um, Moving on from transport, I wanted to ask you about the role of advocacy. Climate Council, as I mentioned earlier, many other organisations did a range of advocacy work on the targets, but of course on lots of different policy areas. It often feels though like a bit of a David and Goliath battle with the fossil fuel lobby being pretty powerful and being very well funded. Recently, we had 20,000 people in our community sign our petition calling for the strongest possible 2035 target. The reasons for signing, for instance, Alistair said he was signing for his children and grandchildren's future. Amalia said there was nothing more important than doing everything possible to prevent environmental collapse. It's a huge amount of passion in our community. And I wondered if you could reflect on what you think is really effective in advocacy in translating that community passion into influencing people like you that are coming up with these policies that are so important to tackling the climate crisis.
So I think, if I could just say, Amanda, I think the role you play is very important in shaping the public debate and providing a permission structure, in the public debate, because there's plenty of people, as you might have noticed if you read the newspapers each morning, plenty of people arguing that we're doing far too much and, Bowen's ruining Australia with all this renewable energy. I read it every morning at 5 a.m. when I get out of bed. So there's plenty of counter arguments out there. So what you do is very important. You and I don't always agree. And if you and I always agreed, then one of us isn't doing our job, I think, because that we have different jobs to do. But I think places like, groups like the Climate Council play a very valuable role in raising issues. Again, I might not agree with every single thing, and you might not agree with every single thing I do, but it's it's important for the debate, and I think you do it very well, credibly. Again, whether we agree or disagree, you've got to have a credible argument, and I think you bring a credible approach. What I would say to your question about what's effective, I think this sort of respectful dialogue is very important. I understand protest and respect it, but I think, and I understand the frustration that leads people to do it, but it doesn't change the way I think about things. Conversations like this can change. If I hear good ideas and think, oh, actually they had a point there, etc. And I think the important thing is for the movement to not let the perfect be the enemy of progress. And to, again, as I sort of hinted before, don't accidentally fall in the argument, everything that is being done isn't good enough, so therefore, we should just criticize everything. Call for more by all means. I welcome that. But, also, let's not pretend that we haven't made huge strides in the last 3 years or so. Renewable energy will get to 50% of our grid in the not too distant future. That's massive. We were nowhere near on track for that 3 years ago. Exporting renewable energy is hard work, but we are going to get there, and we're making huge strides. As I said, safeguards reforms, reducing emissions by the equivalent of a third of Australia's aviation emissions. Or you referred to the new vehicle efficiency standards briefly. They've been in the too hard basket for 20 years more. More governments are saying, oh no, that's all too hard. America did it in 1974 and we did it in 2024. It was hard. I'm not sure what was harder for me to do, frankly, safeguards or new vehicle efficiency standards, but I know they're both bloody hard reforms with plenty of nonsense being spoken about them and hard to get them through the parliament, but they're working. The new vehicle efficiency standard hasn't really started to work yet. We're getting just the early buds. There are going to be EVs on our roads next year that you've never heard of, because of the new vehicle efficiency standards. That's a wonderful thing. So let's not pretend that progress isn't happening and that hard things haven't been done, because a lot of these reforms have been very hard, and a lot of other governments, frankly, would have and have shied away from them, and we haven't.
Yeah, and the new vehicle efficiency standards was a very important one. And
Mm.
yeah, we reflect that it's very important to have the broad ecosystem of those groups and politicians, government, all pushing in the same direction, isn't it? I wanted to move on to talking about the international action and COP31. Obviously, you've just been at the UN General Assembly and at Climate Week, and we saw you standing on the stage with the First Lady of Turkey. Is there anything we can do to help to get this COP secured, Chris? Do we camp outside the embassy?
I wish I could say there was, Amanda. Really. No, the situation remains as it has for a long time, that we have the overwhelming support of the world to host COP31 in Australia. But unfortunately, it's not a ballot. The COP rules as I've learnt along the way, work very much on a consensus. And that means basically unanimity. And so Turkey is bidding, and they basically have to agree with the outcome. Um, so it's sort of meant to work on the basis that, a country that doesn't have the support looks at it and says, okay, well, we tried and we don't have the support, so we're going to step aside. But there's no requirement to do that. And that's not what's happening. So I have been in discussions with my Turkish counterpart, no secret about that, in New York and before that, and other people like the Turkish First Lady, who is, to her credit, very interested in these matters and leading a net zero waste initiative in Turkey, which has got international traction now. So, we respect that, and I acknowledge that. So that's why we're in discussions with Turkey to find if there isn't a way that we couldn't host COP31 in Australia with the Pacific, and they accept that outcome and, have something which is important for them achieved. So I'm not going to go into the details about those conversations. Nothing's agreed till everything's agreed. And those conversations are ongoing. The alternative is, if we don't sort that out, our group can say, Australia is the choice, and then Turkey could say we don't accept that. And that outcome, neither Australia nor Turkey host the COP. Germany does, and we lose the opportunity. Germany, because they're the host of the UNFCCC. And I think that's a massive missed opportunity for the Pacific, because one of the reasons I want to do this is there's no better opportunity for the Pacific to get the attention of the world on their existence. And, if we were COP chair, I would make sure that that's the case, that the Pacific was prominent in the COP process, not just in the fortnight of the COP, but, in the entire year of the COP. And there's things about oceans that the Pacific and existence that the Pacific's been trying to get up at COPs for years, and they haven't been able to. Well, they would have in us an ally as COP president, and I want to see that happen. And also, it's a remarkable opportunity for Australia to show the rest of the world, this is tough. This is not easy. We're a fossil fuel exporter. We don't deny it. But here's our massive transition that's underway, and we can all do it, and we can all help each other. And I want a COP also focused on implementation, because lots of people go to COPs and make all sorts of promises. I want to run a COP that focuses on getting the job done and
On
real
getting it done.
outcomes.
And Chris, obviously, when you host a COP, countries are under increased scrutiny, and that would probably be no more so than from the Pacific. And there have been Pacific leaders critical of Australia's ongoing fossil fuel industry and approvals. And although the support for renewable energy investment in the Pacific has also been very welcomed, do you think Australia can host a COP with the Pacific genuinely if we're not going further on coal and gas?
Look, the Pacific is 100% behind this bid. I think it's very careful, and you're not doing this, Amanda, but I just think it's very careful to stipulate the Pacific is not one place. Like, there's 14 countries. Sometimes one Pacific minister says something, the media writes, the Pacific thinks, well, I'm sorry, the Pacific is 14 sovereign
There's a
independent
lot of
nations.
diversity,
That's
yes.
right. And, if you look at the president of Palau, who in his speech to the General Assembly took time out to praise Australia's NDC and say, this is really what we need, this sort of leadership. And, we are strongly backing the bid to host COP31 in Adelaide. I'm not saying, that's he's speaking on behalf of his country. But, that is a common view. And, again, I want to bring no disrespect to any other country. I want to stipulate this, but it's time. We've had the COP now in the COPs in my time in Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, in Azerbaijan, and we're going to Brazil in 50 days. That'll be great. But then, to go back to Turkey is, I think it's time to bring it to the Southern Hemisphere. It's been 30 COPs. I think 6 of them in the Southern Hemisphere, 24 in the North. This is time for our region.
And I know, excuse me, that our audience has more questions: native forest logging, agriculture, trucks, AI data centers, and their consumption of energy that we won't have time to get to tonight. And certainly more questions about the Pacific and COP, as well as fossil fuel exports. But I wanted to just close with another question that is from one of our supporters, Anthony. He said, given all that you know about climate change and the risks, are you optimistic for Australia? What does the future look like?
I choose to be optimistic, but perhaps more accurately, I choose to be determined. You know,
Mm,
I describe myself as determined more than optimistic because there's a lot that can go wrong. But I think we're all determined to make sure that that is not the outcome that we achieve. And you know, the opportunity, like the good news, if we get it right, is just extraordinary. So yes, there's plenty at stake. There's plenty of risks. Absolutely, we talked about a lot of those. There's also a remarkable opportunity to create jobs of the future, to you know, make Australia the indispensable nation in the decarbonisation journey of the world. I mean that very sincerely. So yeah, I'm probably not an optimist or a pessimist. I'm just a determined bastard, and
getting on with it.
and yeah, absolutely determined to keep going, and to ignore, you know, the deniers and the delayers who are very prominent in the media because they're wrong, and we know that climate action is the right course.
Mm. Thanks, Chris, and thank you for your time tonight. Really appreciate it. We've covered quite a lot of the pre-submitted questions, but as I said, there's obviously always a whole lot more. And if you want answers on the Climate Council's perspective, you can always go to our website where there's lots of different resources. Also wanted to acknowledge that the Climate Council is obviously community funded, so we bring these events to you because of the generous support of our donors and supporters. So if you've enjoyed the event, consider supporting us into the future. And there'll be an email that comes out after this webinar distributing it. So if you want to send it to friends and family or watch it again to dissect exactly what Chris said on different aspects, you're very welcome to do so. So I hope you enjoyed the webinar tonight. And again, Chris, thank you very much for making the time to have a chat to us, and real opportunity for us all to get your perspective and understand where you're coming from on the range of different issues that we've covered.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks all. Do it again sometime.